Emily Carter used to believe that love aged like wine, deepening with time and patience. Lately, it felt more like water left standing, clear, tasteless, and forgotten. She noticed it most in the evenings, when the house filled with quiet instead of conversation. Daniel Carter would come home later than promised, loosen his tie, and retreat into his phone or his thoughts. He wasn't cruel or unfaithful. He was simply absent in ways that were harder to name and easier to excuse. Emily learned to move around his silences. She reheated dinners, folded laundry alone, and told herself that this was what adulthood looked like: shared responsibilities, separate worlds. When she asked how his day had been, Daniel answered efficiently, like someone closing a task. When she spoke about her own worries, he nodded, distracted, as if her words were background noise. She didn't argue. She had stopped arguing months ago when she realized that being right didn't make her feel less lonely. Lucas Miller entered her life without ceremony. He had been Daniel's friend since college, the kind of friendship built on shared history and unspoken loyalty. Lucas came by occasionally to watch a game, to help with a stubborn repair, to drop off something Daniel had forgotten. Emily noticed him because he noticed things. He asked how she was and waited for the answer. He remembered details she hadn't meant to share. He listened without interrupting, a simple courtesy that felt unfamiliar. There was nothing dramatic about their first real conversation. It happened in the kitchen while Daniel took a call in the other room. Lucas commented on a photo on the fridge, Emily at the beach years ago, laughing into the wind. "You look happy there," he said, not as an observation, but as a question. Emily smiled and shrugged, unsure why the moment unsettled her. She told herself it was harmless, that kindness didn't have hidden meanings unless you gave them one. Over the following weeks, life continued in its predictable rhythm. Daniel worked late. Emily filled her days with routines that left little room for reflection. Lucas appeared now and then, always polite, never crossing a line. Yet Emily felt the shift inside herself, a quiet alertness she hadn't felt in years. She found herself anticipating conversations that lasted a few minutes longer than necessary, noticing how Lucas's calm steadiness contrasted with Daniel's distracted energy. Emily tried to correct course. She suggested date nights, weekend walks, small rituals meant to stitch closeness back together. Daniel agreed in theory, forgot in practice. When plans fell through, he apologized quickly and promised better next time. Emily accepted the apologies because rejecting them felt like giving up, and she wasn't ready to do that. She told herself marriage went through seasons. She told herself patience was love. One evening, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Rain rattled the windows, and the power flickered before cutting out completely. Daniel was stuck at work, delayed by traffic and deadlines. Lucas arrived with a borrowed generator, having texted Daniel first. Emily hesitated before letting him in, aware of the hour and the quiet house. She reminded herself that this was normal, practical, necessary. They sat in the living room with a single lamp casting soft light. The generator hummed outside, steady and reassuring. Conversation came easily, drifting from harmless topics to more personal ones without effort. Lucas spoke about feeling stuck between expectations and choices, about friendships that changed as life narrowed its focus. Emily listened, recognizing pieces of herself in his words. When it was her turn, she surprised herself by being honest. She spoke about loneliness without using the word, about days that felt full yet empty. Lucas didn't offer solutions. He didn't minimize her feelings or rush to defend Daniel. He simply listened, his attention unbroken. The simplicity of it made Emily's chest ache. She realized how long it had been since someone had held space for her thoughts without turning them into problems to solve. When the power returned, neither of them rushed to stand. Emily checked the time and felt a flicker of guilt, sharp and sudden. She excused herself, busied her hands, created distance where it belonged. Lucas noticed and nodded, understanding without explanation. He gathered his things, thanked her for the conversation, and left with a quiet promise to check on the generator later. That night, Daniel came home exhausted and apologetic. Emily listened, nodded, and asked the questions she always asked. She didn't mention Lucas beyond a passing note about the generator. As Daniel fell asleep, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She replayed the evening in fragments, not because anything improper had happened, but because something important had. She felt seen in a way that unsettled her, and the recognition scared her more than the loneliness ever had. Emily turned on her side and closed her eyes, telling herself that awareness was not action, that feelings were not choices. Yet she sensed the ground beneath her had shifted. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence carried a question she couldn't ignore, one that lingered as sleep finally found her and promised that the days ahead would demand answers. Noah was born on a gray morning that softened every sharp thought Emily had carried through the last months of pregnancy. When the nurse placed him in her arms, the world narrowed to his weight, his warmth, the small, determined sound of his breathing. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt anchored to something real. Whatever else was wrong in her life, this child was hers, and that felt undeniable. Michael stood nearby, stiff and uncertain, offering congratulations that sounded rehearsed. Linda cried loudly, as if grief and joy shared the same language for her. Robert shook Michael's hand with solemn approval. Daniel lingered at the back of the room, quiet in a way Emily had never seen before. When their eyes met, he smiled, but it didn't reach his face. Emily noticed the change and filed away. Motherhood sharpened her attention. She began to see details she might once have ignored. The first weeks passed in exhaustion and routine. Feedings blurred into nights. Emily learned Noah's cries and rhythms, the subtle ways he communicated need. Michael returned to work quickly, citing deadlines. Linda insisted on staying most days, reorganizing cabinets, and correcting Emily's instincts with practiced authority. Daniel visited less often now, his presence replaced by messages asking if she needed anything. It was during a routine pediatric visit that the calm finally cracked. The doctor spoke gently, explaining that a minor medical concern required standard testing. Emily agreed without hesitation. She had nothing to hide, no reason to worry. When the results came back, they included genetic markers that didn't align the way they should have. The doctor hesitated, then suggested additional confirmation tests, careful not to alarm her. Emily went home unsettled but not yet afraid. She told Michael about the follow-up tests. He frowned, irritated by inconvenience more than concern. "Do whatever they need," he said. "I'm sure it's nothing." The confirmation came 2 weeks later, delivered in a small office with neutral walls and a voice trained to remain steady. The words landed slowly, rearranging Emily's understanding of her life piece by piece. The results indicated that Michael was not Noah's biological father. Emily didn't cry. She thanked the doctor, gathered the papers, and drove home in silence. Shock hollowed her out, leaving room only for questions she couldn't yet shape. She replayed the past year, searching for explanations that didn't exist. Michael reacted with disbelief, that quickly hardened into suspicion. He accused, demanded, paced the living room as if truth might change under pressure. Emily listened without interrupting. When he asked how this could have happened, she had no answer that made sense. That night, Emily didn't sleep. Instead, she thought of Daniel's attentiveness, her parents' control, the way everyone had seemed so invested in managing her world. The connections formed against her will, each one heavier than the last. By morning, denial was no longer possible. She called Daniel and asked him to come over. When he arrived, he looked older, wearier. Emily held the test results between them like a boundary. She didn't accuse. She didn't explain. She simply asked him to tell her the truth that Daniel's silence was long enough to be an answer. He spoke carefully, avoiding details, framing his words as regret without responsibility. He said it had been a mistake, that he never meant for things to go as far as they had. He said he wanted to protect her, that he thought sparing her the truth was an act of love. Emily listened, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. She realized then that what hurt most was not the betrayal itself, but how easily he justified it. How calmly he spoke of decisions that had reshaped her life without her consent. When Daniel finished, Emily asked only one question. Who else knows? He didn't answer immediately. That pause told her everything. Linda and Robert arrived later that day, summoned by Daniel rather than Emily. They came prepared, their expressions already arranged. Linda spoke first, her voice smooth, urgent. She acknowledged the truth without naming it, insisting that what mattered now was unity. Robert backed her with silence that felt deliberate, practiced. They urged Emily to think of Noah, of the family's reputation, of the damage that exposure would cause. They reminded her of everything they had done for her, everything she stood to lose. Michael, they said, didn't need to know more than necessary. The world didn't need to know anything at all. Emily felt something inside her settle, not into despair, but into clarity. She looked at her parents, then at Daniel, and finally at Michael, who stood frozen at the edge of the room, struggling to understand what had already been decided without him. Emily realized that the illusion she had lived inside was never meant to protect her. It was meant to preserve them. I won't carry this alone, she said quietly. The room went still. Linda's composure cracked. Robert's jaw tightened. Daniel looked at her with a mix of fear and disbelief, as if he were only now realizing she might refuse her assigned role. Emily picked up Noah from his bassinet and held him close. She understood, with sudden certainty, that silence would not save her child. It would only teach him the same lesson she had learned too late. As she walked past her family toward the door, Emily felt grief, but also something steadier beneath it. The truth had broken her life open, but it had also given her a choice. And this time, she intended to make it herself. Emily moved out 3 days later, packing only what Noah needed and what she could carry without shaking. She didn't announce her decision. She simply left while the house was quiet, leaving behind the life that had been managed for her so carefully. The small apartment Grace Miller helped her find was modest and unfamiliar, but it belonged to Emily alone, and that mattered more than comfort. Michael did not try to stop her. He oscillated between anger and withdrawal, directing his resentment toward everyone except himself. He told Emily he needed time, space, distance from a truth he did not know how to carry. She accepted that with a tired nod. Whatever they had been pretending to build together had collapsed under the weight of lies that were never hers to begin with. That Linda's calls began immediately. Tea first, they were pleading. She spoke of forgiveness, of mistakes that could be buried for the sake of peace. She reminded Emily of everything the family had provided, every sacrifice she claimed to have made. When Emily did not respond the way Linda expected, the tone shifted. Concern hardened into accusation. Emily was ungrateful. Emily was dramatic. Emily was destroying the family. Robert did not call at all. Daniel sent messages that were carefully worded, apologetic in language, but evasive in meaning. He said he was struggling. He said he never wanted things to unfold this way. He said he hoped one day she would understand. Emily read each message once and then archived it, unwilling to let his version of remorse reshape her resolve. The pressure extended beyond phone calls. Family friends stopped by unannounced, armed with gentle questions and pointed advice. They spoke about reconciliation and privacy, about how certain truths did more harm than good. Emily listened politely, then closed the door behind them with a finality that surprised even her. Grace was the only one who did not ask Emily to explain herself. She watched Noah while Emily slept, filled the refrigerator, and sat beside her during long evenings when the silence felt too loud. "You don't have to decide everything today," she said once. "Just don't let them decide for you." It was Grace who suggested Emily speak to a lawyer, not out of revenge, but out of protection. Attorney James Holloway listened without interruption as Emily laid out the facts, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was admitting. He asked questions that were precise and unemotional, treating her story not as scandal, but as a series of violations. When he explained her options, Emily felt something close to relief. There was a path forward that did not require her to disappear. Filing the case was both terrifying and clarifying. The legal documents named what her family had refused to acknowledge: deception, coercion, and intentional harm. It outlined how Emily had been pressured into silence, how decisions had been made on her behalf, how the truth had been concealed to protect those with power. Each sentence felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. The response was swift and vicious. Linda accused Emily of cruelty, of exploiting the situation for attention. Robert finally spoke, his words clipped and cold, warning her about consequences she could not undo. Daniel vanished entirely, retreating behind lawyers and statements that avoided direct accountability. Michael distanced himself publicly, emphasizing confusion and betrayal, as if Emily were the sole architect of the chaos. The court proceedings stripped away the family's polished image layer by layer. Patterns emerged that Emily had sensed but never named. Years of control masked as care, silence rewarded, obedience expected. Witnesses described Linda's influence, Robert's refusal to intervene, Daniel's favored position. The truth did not need embellishment. It was heavy enough on its own. Emily testified once. She spoke about trust, about how being surrounded by family had not made her safe. She spoke about Noah, about her responsibility to raise him without lies shaping his future. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She told the truth and let it stand. When the ruling came, it was decisive. The court found her parents liable for their role in the deception and the harm that followed. Financial restitution was ordered, an amount significant enough that it could not be absorbed quietly. Assets would need to be sold. The house Emily had grown up in, the symbol of stability Linda had guarded so fiercely, was among them. Emily felt no triumph, only a sober acknowledgement of cause and effect. Outside the courtroom, cameras waited, hungry for spectacle. Emily declined to speak. She held Noah close and walked past them without looking back. The story was no longer theirs to shape, but it was also no longer hers to perform. That night, alone in her apartment, Emily sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker on. She felt grief for the family she had lost, for the version of herself that had believed silence was safety. She also felt something new, fragile but real. Freedom carried a cost, but it also carried possibility. Emily knew the fallout was not over. Relationships would not heal overnight, and some never would. But as Noah slept peacefully in the next room, she understood that the most difficult step had already been taken. She had chosen truth, and whatever came next would be built on that foundation. The sale of the Carter house was finalized on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind that passed unnoticed by most people. Emily learned about it through a brief message from attorney James Holloway, factual and restrained. She read it twice, then set her phone down and stared at the wall until the weight of it settled. The house where she had learned to ride a bike, where silence had been mistaken for harmony, no longer belonged to her parents. The symbol they had guarded above all else was gone. Linda did not call. Robert sent a single email, formal and distant, stating that the court's decision had been complied with and asking that future communication go through legal channels. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of pain, only closure framed as procedure. Emily felt a familiar ache at the restraint, but it no longer hollowed her out. She had learned that silence could speak clearly when you finally understood its language. Daniel remained absent. Occasionally, Emily heard fragments through others. He had moved, he was struggling, he blamed everyone and no one. She did not seek confirmation. Whatever reckoning awaited him was no longer hers to carry. Life, practical and indifferent, continued. Emily returned to work part-time, arranging her hours around Noah's needs. The apartment grew warmer with routine. Morning light across the kitchen floor, toys gathered in corners, the soft certainty of schedules made by choice rather than obligation. Grace visited often, sometimes bringing dinner, sometimes just sitting on the floor with Noah while Emily folded laundry. Their conversations were quieter now, less about survival and more about the future. Michael finalized the separation without drama. He spoke to Emily once, his voice weary, admitting that he had ignored too much because it was easier than confronting discomfort. He wished her well, a phrase that felt sincere and insufficient all at once. Emily accepted it without bitterness. Some truths arrived too late to repair damage, but they could still prevent its repetition. As months passed, Emily noticed subtle changes in herself. She spoke more directly, apologized less reflexively. She no longer softened her needs to preserve someone else's comfort. When questions arose about her family, she answered simply, without defense or detail. The truth did not require performance. There were difficult days. Certain memories surfaced without warning, triggered by places or phrases. On those days, Emily allowed herself to grieve, not just the family she had lost, but the version of love she had once hoped would be returned to her unchanged. She learned that healing was not a straight line, but a series of choices made again and again. One afternoon, Emily took Noah to the park near their apartment. He toddled uncertainly across the grass, determined and unafraid. Watching him, Emily felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. He would grow up knowing boundaries. He would learn that love did not require silence, that loyalty did not demand self-erasure. That evening, as she put Noah to bed, Emily told him a story, not about the past, but about the future. She spoke of honesty, of courage, of building a life that did not depend on hiding. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He slept peacefully, secure in the presence of someone who chose him without condition. Later, alone in the living room, Emily reflected on the path that had brought her here. She did not regret seeking justice, though the cost had been high. Accountability had not restored what was lost, but it had prevented the lie from continuing its quiet damage. The house her parents sold had sheltered many years of denial. Letting it go was not cruelty, it was consequence. Emily knew that reconciliation, if it ever came, would have to be built on truth rather than obligation. Until then, she was content with distance that protected her peace. She turned off the lights and looked out the window one last time before bed. The city hummed below, full of lives unfolding beyond her own. Emily felt no urge to explain herself to it. Her story no longer belonged to those who had rewritten it without consent. She had reclaimed it, one choice at a time. And as she closed the door to the day, Emily understood that freedom was not found in winning or losing, but in refusing to live a life shaped by someone else's silence.